How's it going, everybody? I am DeanoGTO, and today we're going to be talking about the Polish heavy tank line in World of Tanks. I'm just going to quickly just describe what I think is like the best way to describe these vehicles at the very start. These vehicles have pretty like mid-range sort of mobility. They have high alpha damage and they're great hull down. So they're high alpha damage hull down heavy tanks, which are pretty decent speed-wise. They're pretty middle of the road in that regard. So if you like that sort of if you like the idea of that sort of playstyle, then this might be the line for you, but there are a few things that you need to be very aware of when it comes to this line. So, first and probably the most important thing is pretty much every single vehicle in this line is a full stack grind. Like, I'm sure you're probably aware of vehicles like the Leo PTA, as an example, where whenever you get to this thing from the Indian Panzer, literally nothing carries over at all. You literally get to you get to the Leo PTA, and it's a completely stock vehicle. Like it's kind of like what happens with the AMX-30, I believe, in the French tree as well, which I'm very, very close to unlocking. You get to this thing, and there's like one gun that carries over from another tank. Like there's pretty much nothing. You pretty much unlock the vehicles, and well, that's it. You don't really get anything extra. Like the top gun in the previous tank is the stock gun on the tank above. So that's kind of brutal, and it does mean that the grinds can be very long, but if you do it the way I did it, then it can save you a bit of time when it comes to grinding. Next thing is, well, this tank is bad enough on its own to be a con in this line. The 40 TP. That is one of the worst tier 6s I have ever driven in this game. Bear in mind that vehicle competes with things like T-34-85s, Cromwells, KV-85s, T-150s, hell, even heavy tank number 6 and Tiger 131s. I honestly would say all of those vehicles are far superior to the 40 TP. The 40 TP is horrendous. It has a high amount of penetration, it has 240 alpha damage, that's it. That's all it has going for it. And I guess you could argue 8 degrees of gun depression as well, but goddamn, that is one of the worst tier 6s I've ever driven. And if you're willing to go through that grind, you do get gradually better vehicles as you're going up. Like tier 7 is okay. I've heard some people say that tier 7 is really bad, but after the tier 6, it honestly feels spectacular. Like it honestly feels great to play the tier 7 after playing that atrocious tier 6. But going from the tier 7 to the tier 8, you definitely notice that the tier 8 is definitely better tier for tier than the tier 7. So tier 6 and 7, tier 7 I would say is mid-range for tier 7 in terms of overall power. It's not as good as things like T29, and I guess you would say the Tiger 1. I guess the Tiger 1 is still considered to be one of the best tier 7 heavies. I would say it's about even with something like an IS, but it's definitely better than things like the Tiger P and the KV3 and things like that. It's definitely better than tanks like that. So yeah, tier 6 and tier 7 are a bit iffy, but tier 8, 9 and 10 for the most part I think are really solid vehicles. So let's see, so I think that's pretty much everything I really wanted to mention just there now. Oh, actually, another thing just quickly. Starting from tier 7, all the vehicles pretty much do between 35 and 40 kilometers an hour. Tier 7 does 35, tier 9 does 35, and tier 10 does 35. Tier 8 is the exception to the rule that does 40. So pretty much all these vehicles do around 30 to 35 kilometers an hour on most terrains. It's only really when you're climbing slopes and on like really like bad terrain, like the swampy area on, I can't remember the name of the map, Lakeville I think it is, that you really struggle to like move around. For the most part, the vehicles mobility wise feel fine. And in fact, they feel decent enough to the point where I didn't even bother unlocking the engines in all of these vehicles from tier 6 and above. Completely just ignore the engines because they just did not feel worth it. Although I will admit, this thing here I think could use like a 500 or 600 horsepower engine because it is way too slow the way it is right now. But we will get back to that in a second. So if this line seems like the kind of thing you'd be interested in, then I guess continue on with this video. But if you're not interested in dealing with some pretty brutal grinds and basically having to restart the grind from scratch every single time you go up a tier, then you probably want to avoid this line for as long as possible and potentially use blueprints to try and make the grind a little bit faster for yourself, because that would actually probably be a pretty good idea, especially when it comes to skipping this thing and potentially this thing. But for the most part, I think the 45 TP is an okay grind, but I have heard some people say that they really hated it. So let's start off here with the 25 TP. And we'll have a go say its name as well, the Kazoost. Well, Kazoost 2. That's how that looks to me, at least. That's probably completely wrong, but I had to go. So, I'm going to be honest with you at the very start. I think you should save about 8,000 XP, 8,000 free XP I should say, for this vehicle at the very start. Before you even unlock this vehicle, have 8,000 free XP just ready to go for this tank, because you're going to need to unlock the turret, the gun, and the tracks in order to be able to use this gun here, because this gun is absolutely horrendous for a tier 5 medium tank. It has 52 penetration. 52. A tier 5. I don't even think you can pen a T-34 with that. In fact, I'm pretty sure you can't. I mean, the funny thing about this here is this thing here can make things like Cromwells and, well, it can make things like Cromwells and Comets and things like that. I think that'll probably be the only time ever like a Cromwell will consistently bounce shots from a tank. Just coming up against one of these using this 40mm bow vertical gun, and I highly recommend that you save 3 XP just to get this turret, this gun, and the tracks, just so you can use this top gun just as fast as possible. Because you do not want to go through using this gun, because that gun is going to be horrendous. Now, one thing I want to quickly mention is you don't actually have to unlock the engine or the tracks on this tank. You could probably skip those if you wanted to. Personally, I decided I wanted to get them because I actually didn't mind playing this tank. But one thing you 100% want to get on this tank is this gun here. Definitely unlock this gun on this tank, because if you don't, you're making the 40 TP grind a lot harder than it needs to be. Because the 40 TP grind is going to be an absolute nightmare. And I'll just quickly jump in just to show you why this thing is so bad. So this is the gun you get from the 40, or not from the 40, this is the gun you get from the 25 TP. It has 135 damage, 135 penetration, 80 range of gun depression, and the accuracy and aim time actually seem pretty decent on it. And then when you put the top turret on it, the aim time gets a little bit better, and it looks like the DPM gets a little bit better as well. So seems like an alright gun for the most part. But then you have to take into account other factors on this tank. The armor is absolutely useless. It is 90mm and it's flat. Now, I'm sure you've all come across things like, I don't know, let's use an example like Tiger 131. How well does 100mm of armor work for that? Bear in mind, this thing's armor is angled about as well as a Tiger 131's armor, and it's 10mm worse. Yeah, the armor on the Tiger 131 is already pretty crap. Can you imagine how bad it is on this? The frontal armor on this thing is worthless. And the side armor, the second you see something with a 122mm gun is on the enemy team, your side armor is useless. Because like you can deflect things like 120mm guns, but 122s, not possible. You'll get overmatched and you'll take a ton of damage very, very easily. So the temptation with this thing is to sit in the background and try and avoid being the main center of attention, because otherwise you'll die very quickly, because it's really easy to kill this thing. So people obviously want to go for it to get the damage. But here's the problem. The upgraded gun on this thing, 90mm, the gun with the decent penetration, 156. This gun here is absolutely atrocious. It barely can hit anything. It has a 2.7 second base aiming time with 0.4 accuracy. It is absolutely horrific, just how bad the accuracy is on this tank. And the other problem with trying to stay in the background or not being not being aggressive in this tank is if you get left behind in this tank, this happened to me a bunch of times when I was playing this vehicle. If you're not aggressive enough in this tank, you're 100% going to get left behind in the battle and get no further damage in the game. You need to hope the enemy team pushes forward into you for you to get a lot of damage in this thing. Because if you have to push forward into them, most of your teammates are going to just fly ahead of you. In fact, some heavy tanks can actually fly ahead of you in this thing. and you'll just get left behind and not be able to like keep up with the flow of the battle, and pretty much not be able to do anything else in the actual game itself. It's pretty atrocious, and I don't even recommend unlocking the upgrade engine on this thing, because the difference it makes to the oops, didn't mean to that, but we will get back to that in a minute. Even if you apply the upgrade, even if you install the upgrade engine in this thing, it ends up with, I think it's, yeah, it's an 11 horsepower per ton ratio. That's still absolutely horrendous. That's still absolutely abysmal power weight ratio. So don't even bother. Just try and get through this thing as quickly as possible. I would even recommend Steven Blueprints try and get through this thing as quick as possible to get to the 45 TP, because I have no intention of ever playing this thing again. I'm very tempted to actually just free XP this, so I never have to, because this tank is horrific. Now let's go on to the 45 TP, which was a breath of fresh air after playing the 40 TP for me. I've heard a lot of people complain about this tank and saying that this tank is bad as well, but after the 40 TP, this thing is an absolute pleasure to play. The 105mm gun on this tank I actually really enjoyed using, and even this 90mm gun, the gun that's absolute garbage on the previous tank, actually felt pretty decent on this, because it has like a 2.3 second aiming time with the upgraded turret, and 2.4 second aiming time with the stock turret. So gun handling wise, it's not that bad. It's not as bad as it was on the tier 6. Plus you pretty much like get an extra like 550 health, so you can actually afford to be a little bit more, well, you can afford to be, I'm trying to think of the correct word. So you can afford to just like sit and aim your shots. I was trying to think of a word to describe that, but I couldn't think of one. You can afford to sit and aim your shots and take hits if you need to. So it really doesn't feel too bad to have like a 2.4 or 2.3 second aiming time on this gun. For the most part, it feels fine. I actually enjoyed playing this thing for the most part. Didn't really have too many issues with it. Now, you are going to want to get this 105mm, because this 105mm, there's a very minimal DPM loss. Aiming time remains the same, and you get an extra, I think it works out as like 36 penetration, which is a massive help, and you get an extra 80 alpha damage per shot, while keeping pretty much around the same sort of DPM. Now, one thing I actually find kind of interesting about this vehicle, and it's something that I always found kind of funny, was the stock turret has 1186 health. So you get 14 health by going up to the top turret, for some reason. It's the only tank in the game I've ever seen which doesn't have a health pool that ends in 0. Like, I feel like there might be some, well, 0 or 5, I should say. Only tank I can say for certain that has such a weird number as like its health pool, with the stock turret at least. So yeah, and you can see here that I don't even have to mount the top tracks in order to be able to use the top turret and the top engine. That's why I just completely skipped them and just decided to move on to the tier 8, because there's no real point in unlocking them if you don't need to. Because that was my philosophy when I came to this line, and it allowed me to get to the line a lot faster than I think most other people would have, because it just saves you so much time just skipping those parts that you don't actually need, especially on this thing here, because it didn't feel necessary to unlock the top engine, because this thing does 35 kilometers an hour everywhere anyway, so it just felt like a waste of time, so I just didn't bother, and it worked pretty well for me. So pretty much what I would recommend with this thing here playstyle wise is, whenever you're top tier, you can kind of try to play a heavy tank, like try to go head to head with things like T29s and ISs and stuff like that. I don't recommend doing that if there are other tanks that are heavier armored than you. Like if there's an Oni and then there's you, like don't try and use your armor over the Oni, because, well, the Oni is going to be a lot more survivable than you are. But the armor can be used against like equal tier to heavy tanks whenever you're side scraping, and whenever you're potentially like angled the armor like correctly for the upper front plate to bounce a couple of hits. But for the most part, I would recommend trying to play this thing as sort of like a support heavy tank, like supporting medium tanks on like the medium tank flank. It actually does a pretty decent job with that, because like it's pretty much like an IS in terms of mobility, and that's actually pretty much how I played this thing. I played this thing as a slightly more flexible IS with less armor, but was able to get around the map more consistently, more effectively, with a faster rate of fire on its gun, and a higher penetration amount as well. So pretty much I just like replicated my IS playstyle, just with a bit more flexibility and less off damage, but more shots that I could put out. I had a lot of fun in this thing. I thought this tank was fun to drive for the most part. And you can also hold down in this tank with the top turret, and the top turret will actually block some shots for you, because it's actually pretty decently sloped and angled, and it has like 170 frontal armor. So, for the most part, I thought this tank was fun. I actually liked it quite a lot, but the tier 8 definitely is an upgrade. It is definitely a far superior tank tier for tier in comparison to the tier 7. Tier 7 is pretty mid-range for tier 7 heavy tanks. This thing here I would say is probably near the top for tier 8 heavy tanks. Because this thing here, it has a 420 alpha damage 122mm gun. Its mobility overall is pretty damn decent. I mean, it has the option of an 800 horsepower engine. It has a 40 km/h top speed. It's 2 km/h faster than the IS-3. The upper front plate and the lower front plate, they're not peg-nosed, which is something you would usually expect from something with this sort of body shape. But because it's not peg-nosed, it actually gives you an interesting advantage, which a lot of people don't really consider when it comes to driving this tank. You can angle your upper front plate. It actually took me a little while to get used to this here, because I'm so used to vehicles like this, like the 110, the IS-3, that all have like peg-nosed frontal armor. This thing doesn't. You can actually angle this thing and actually make more effective use of the frontal armor, because it's kind of like a mix, like a fusion between something like a Tiger 2 and an IS-3. And it actually was a lot of fun to play for me, because I thought this tank was fantastic. It takes the gun depression and the slope frontal armor of a Tiger 2, combines it with the alpha damage, well, actually a bit more alpha damage than an IS-3, and the turret armor of an IS-3. I thought this thing was a pleasure to play. I actually really enjoyed this vehicle for the most part. I didn't really have too many issues with it, aside from like near the end of my grind where I kept getting tier 10 game after tier 10 game after tier 10 game. And for the first few games, I was having fun with it, but after you get tier 10 game after tier 10 game after tier 10 game, it can get a bit sickening. So yeah, I kind of just pushed through it anyway and finished it off and got to the tier 9. But one thing I want to quickly mention here is the guns. So this thing has the option of a 105mm gun and two 122s. The first one of 122, do not use that gun, because that gun has 175 penetration. It's basically an IS gun at tier 8. It is an awful gun to use, especially when you have the option of this 105mm, which has higher DPM, it has better accuracy, it has better aiming time, and it has better penetration as well. There's no reason to use this 122 whenever you have the option of this 105mm. There is a reason to use this 122, which is the top 122. Just avoid this middle 122. It's not worth using at all. It's pretty much just a waste of XP. It's pretty much an XP sink. You have to unlock it, but don't bother using it. There's no way for working to force you to use it. I would just say avoid that gun and just continue using the 190 penetration 105mm until you get this gun. And this gun here can roll for over 500 damage, and it's really satisfying when it does it. It's one of the hardest hitting tier 8s in the game, and when it comes to like standard vehicles, I think the only vehicle I can think of which has higher alpha damage per shot is the VK100. This tank here, I just had so much fun playing. I mean, it can side scrape, it can angle its frontal armor, it has 8th degrees gun depression, it has a really good frontal turret. Sure, it has a weak point on its lower front plate, and it has a weak point in terms of the cupola, but if you're using your gun depression, the cupola is actually really difficult to get shots into, and because you can side scrape, you don't really need to show the lower front plate as well. I thought this tank was pretty much like a perfect mix of factors with it, with the way it's like shaped and the way it's armored and the way it's angled, or the way everything's angled and the way everything worked out with this tank. I just had so much fun in this thing. So yeah. And when it comes to its accuracy and aiming time and stuff like that, for a gun of this caliber, 0.38 accuracy and 2.7 second aiming time, those are not bad stats. Those are better, I think, from memory, off the top of my head, those are better stats than the IS-3. And you can also see, not quite as extreme as the 45 TP, but you can skip the engine and the radio. The radio is shared with tier 9, but it seemed like a waste of 7,000 XP. I didn't really feel like it was really necessary. I mean, you get an extra 50 you get an extra 50 signal range. Who cares? Like, no one cares about signal range. It makes no difference. So yeah, for the most part with the 53 TP, by the way, pretty much the way I played it was I would side scrape, I would go hold down where possible, and I would basically I basically just adapted the playstyle that I used in the 45 TP, but was more aggressive with it because it could actually get away with it, unlike the 45 TP. So yeah, I thought the 53 TP was like one of the highlights of this line because it was just a fun vehicle to play. Now we're on to the 50 TP. The 50 TP is an interesting vehicle because it shares a lot more in common with the tier 10 than it does with the tier 8 because it has the driver's hatch weak point, it has the massive lower front plate weak point, although the tier 10's lower front plate weak point is nowhere near this big. It has the cupola weak points, it has the turret ring. It shares a lot with the tier 10. It also has the overmatch zone in the turret, by the way. I forgot to actually mention, I don't know what the armor on the roof of the turret of the tier 8 actually is because unfortunately, Tanks GG's armor model for the 53 TP is still broken, even though it's been out for like 6 months or well, 3 to 6 months or something like that. And yeah, it's still broken. There's still no way for me to tell like how much armor the turret armor, or well, how well armored the turret is on the 53 TP. It's still broken. It's just been like that forever now. So yeah, unfortunately, there's no way for me to confirm what the overmatch zones are like on that particular vehicle. But on this thing here, I can tell you. There's a 50mm armor, armor zone up here, which can be overmatched by guns greater than 150mm in caliber. So guns effectively bigger than the 150mm of the E100 will be able to overmatch the roof armor on this tank and basically auto pen. Then when it comes to the cupolas and stuff, the cupolas are fairly big, I guess you could say. But if you're using your gun depression, these are pretty much impossible to hit. And if somebody does hit, it's going to be a bit better angled. And I would say it's a tricky shot to hit that there, especially when you're using your gun depression. And whenever you're using your gun depression, go and hold down, it pretty much removes the majority of the weak points on the hull as well. Sometimes people can get lucky shots into the driver's hatch, but for the most part, you don't really have to worry too much about that. So another thing I want to quickly mention with this tank is the 122mm gun. That's the stock gun on this tank, and the upgrade gun on the tier 8. This gun felt fine as a grinding gun. There are some tanks at tier 9 where the grinding gun feels absolutely horrific, but as long as you play as like a support role in this tank, that 122mm gun is absolutely fine to grind out that 130. Both of them have pretty much exactly the same DPM, so there's really not much of a disadvantage to using the 122 aside from penetration. You might have to carry a few premium rounds in order to be competitive in certain circumstances, but for the most part, that 122 is able to face off against most enemy vehicles you're going to come off against with no real issue. I mean, 420 alpha damage is still higher than the majority of tier 9 heavy tanks. I mean, M103 and Super Conqueror, as an example, don't have the same alpha damage as this thing. They still have less alpha damage than that. So, yeah, this is still definitely a usable gun, but you definitely want to be using the 130 as soon as you unlock it because it is a very potent gun with 560 alpha damage, 250 penetration. Yes, the accuracy and aiming time get a bit worse, but this gun hits like a truck. The only gun at tier 9 on a heavy tank that's actually got higher alpha than this is the Type 4 Heavy's gun. But that gun is incredibly rare to see, and effectively no one really uses that gun because everybody uses the 150mm. I'm like the only guy who uses the 140. I never see the 140 ever used. Everybody uses the 150. It's kind of sad if I'm honest, but yeah. This thing effectively has the biggest gun at tier 9 that fires AP shells, because the 14cm is basically non-existent these days on the Type 4 Heavy. But overall, I thought this tank was pretty fun to play. Its mobility is pretty decent. I didn't even bother unlocking the engine on this thing either, because the engine, well, the mobility just felt fine for the most part. You can improve it further with this nearly 50,000 XP engine. Did not think that was worth 50,000 XP for 50 horsepower, so I just kind of skipped it. So pretty much my recommendation for the playstyle on this thing is just try and stay hold down where possible, because that way you don't have to worry about like the weak points and stuff on the hull. You can side scrape when you need to, but you have to be very, very careful with your angling to make sure that the turret ring isn't potentially a weak point for people just spamming gold rounds, which is pretty common occurrence these days in tier 10 games, or tier 9 and tier 10 games. So as long as you're careful with the angling of the tank whenever you're side scraping, the turret ring shouldn't be that much of an issue, but it's something you do need to be very careful of, and you need to try and avoid doing that if at all possible. I would say if you want to survive as long as possible into a game and avoid losing HP. So pretty much my recommended playstyle would just be trying to keep it hold down where possible. So let's move on to the tier 10, and this is actually the vehicle which I have in my character right now, so let's just quickly just take a look at it. So yeah, as you can see, it has an absolutely gigantic gun, 152.4mm, the biggest heavy tank gun in the game. It has a bunch of weaknesses like the tier 9, it has the cupola, it has the driver's hatch, it has the lower front plate, it has the turret ring as well. The turret ring is not as big of an issue on this tank as it is on the tier 9, but it is something you still have to be kind of aware of because tier 10, well, I was about to say tier 10 heavy tanks, tier 10 tank destroyers firing gold rounds will go through that like butter, so you do need to be kind of careful with your angling no matter what in this game when it comes to tanks with turret rings. So yeah, for the most part, armor is pretty solid, but you do have to be worried about like premium rounds and stuff like that there because they can mess you up. Now, when it comes to the overmatch zone on tap, as I mentioned with the previous tank, the 50mm zone is still there, and it's still an area you can easily take advantage of whenever you're fighting these things in one of these things. Like if you're at 60 TP and you're against another 60 TP, you can just overmatch the roof armor if you're above it with ease, and they won't be able to do much against you to retaliate. So effectively, like the playstyle is just carries over from the tier 9. Just try to avoid showing your driver's hatch and your lower front plate and stuff like that if at all possible. You can side scrape if you need to, but you have to be very careful with the angling. Pretty much what I said about tier 9 just carries up to this thing, just it has a bigger gun now. It has 750 alpha rather than the 560, so your alpha damage goes up by 190 and your penetration remains the same. And your accuracy and aiming time pretty much remain the same as well. So yeah, like this vehicle here, I honestly think it's a pretty solid tier 10, and I'm going to do some videos on the different heavy tanks in this line as well. I'll probably start with the tier 10, work my way down to tier 9, tier 8, and maybe tier 7, but I haven't quite decided. I'm not going to bother with the tier 6. The tier 6, I'm not touching with again with a 10-foot pole. That tank I absolutely despised. But tier 7, 8, 9, and 10, I might go back to and do, well, tier 7, 8, and 9, I might go back to and do individual videos on those, just talking about them directly. But this was more of like an overview video, just talking about all the different vehicles in the line, like what I think of each individual vehicle itself, and just showing you what I did if you were curious. So yeah, let me know what you guys think of this video in the comment section below. Let me know if it was helpful to you, and yeah, hope you enjoyed it. And I'll see you in the next one.